The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Williams pushed his mop bucket down the empty hallway of Pinnacle Technologies, the water sloshing gently with each step. At 2:47 a.m., the gleaming corporate tower was his domain, a kingdom of polished marble and glass that most people only saw during the chaos of business hours. But Marcus knew every corner, every scuff mark, every coffee stain that told the story of another day in the life of Seattle's most successful tech company. His calloused hands gripped the mop handle as he worked methodically, the way his father had taught him to approach every job with pride, no matter how small it seemed to others. The security guard had nodded off at his desk again, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the gentle swoosh of the mop against the floor. In 6 hours, his 8-year-old daughter Emma would wake up, and he'd need to have her breakfast ready before walking her to school. Then he'd catch 3 hours of sleep before his afternoon shift at the hardware store began. This was his life, a carefully choreographed dance of survival, love, and sacrifice that few people would ever see or understand. Marcus had been cleaning these floors for 3 years, ever since Emma's mother left them for a better life in California. He'd watch the executives stride past him during the day shift overlap, their expensive shoes clicking against the floors he'd spent hours perfecting. Most barely acknowledged his existence, treating him like part of the building's infrastructure, necessary but invisible. But tonight felt different. As he rounded the corner toward the executive wing, Marcus noticed a light still on in the corner office. Through the glass wall, he could see a figure slumped over a massive desk, surrounded by towers of papers and empty coffee cups. The nameplate on the door read Hiroshi Tanaka, CEO. Marcus had heard whispers about the new Shaw, a Japanese businessman who'd taken over 6 months ago after the company's founder retired. The rumors painted him as brilliant but cold, a workaholic who'd already laid off 200 employees in the name of efficiency. Some called him ruthless. Others whispered that he was planning to move the entire operation overseas. As Marcus approached with his cart, he could hear something that made him pause. Soft sounds were coming from the office, and not the clicking of keyboards or rustling of papers, but something more human, something broken. The CEO was crying. Marcus had seen plenty of tears in his 34 years. He'd cried them himself during those first months after his wife left, when Emma would ask why mommy wasn't coming home and he didn't have an answer that wouldn't break her heart. He'd cried quiet tears while Emma slept, wondering how he'd make rent, how he'd afford her medicine when she got sick, how he'd give her the life she deserved on a janitor's salary. He recognized the sound of a man trying to hold himself together while everything fell apart. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, mop in hand, wrestling with what to do. Every instinct told him to move along, to respect the man's privacy, to stay invisible as he'd learned to do. But something deeper, something his grandmother had instilled in him about treating people the way you'd want to be treated, made him knock gently on the glass door. Hiroshi looked up, startled, his eyes red and swollen. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across an invisible divide of class, culture, and circumstance. Then Marcus saw something in the CEO's face that he recognized completely, the look of a man carrying weight too heavy for his shoulders. "Deijiring booty suka?" Marcus asked softly, the Japanese words flowing naturally despite the years since he'd used them. Hiroshi's mouth fell open in shock. In all his months in Seattle, surrounded by executives and board members and consultants, no one had spoken to him in his native language. No one had asked if he was okay. You speak Japanese?" Hiroshi whispered, switching to English but with the careful pronunciation of someone still thinking in another language. Marcus stepped into the office, leaving his mop cart in the hallway. "Hi, Sakashi. A little. I lived in Osaka for 2 years after high school. Taught English, learned more than I taught, probably." The CEO wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed to be seen in such a vulnerable state by an employee, especially one he'd never really noticed before. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's been a difficult night." "No need to apologize," Marcus said, pulling up a chair without being invited. Something told him this man needed someone to sit with him more than he needed his floors mopped. Sometimes the weight gets too heavy to carry alone. For the next hour, as the city slept around them, Two men from completely different worlds shared their burdens. Hiroshi spoke about the impossible pressure from the board, the demands to cut costs regardless of the human impact, the loneliness of being seen as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. He talked about his own daughter back in Tokyo, whom he rarely saw because of his work schedule, and how he'd taken this job partly to give her a better future but was terrified he was losing her in the process. Marcus listened, really listened, in a way that reminded Hiroshi of his grandfather, a man who had worked in the coal mines but possessed wisdom that no university could teach. When Hiroshi finished, Marcus shared his own story. He talked about Emma, about working 3 jobs to keep her in good schools, about the fear that haunted every parent trying to raise a child alone. He spoke about dignity and honest work, about how he'd rather clean floors with pride than compromise his values for a bigger paycheck. "You know what your grandfather would say about your situation?" Marcus asked as dawn began to creep through the office windows. "What?" "He'd probably say that a man's worth isn't measured by the profits he generates, but by the people he protects along the way." Hiroshi smiled for the first time in months. "How did you know my grandfather worked in the mines?" "Because you have the same look my father had, like you are carrying the weight of everyone who depends on you. It's an honorable burden, but it doesn't have to crush you." Over the following weeks, something extraordinary began to happen at Pinnacle Technologies. Instead of announcing massive layoffs, Hiroshi called for innovation meetings. Instead of moving operations overseas, he invested in training programs for existing employees. The 200 people who were supposed to lose their jobs were instead offered retraining opportunities and pathways to advancement. Marcus continued his night shift, but now he often found Hiroshi still in his office, and they would talk about business, about family, about the responsibility that comes with having the power to change lives. Hiroshi learned about efficiency from a man who had mastered the art of doing more with less. Marcus learned about leadership from someone who was rediscovering what it meant to serve others rather than simply serve profits. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Productivity increased as employees felt valued rather than expendable. Innovation flourished when people weren't worried about job security. The company's stock price rose, but more importantly, so did employee satisfaction surveys. 3 months after that first conversation, Hiroshi made an announcement that shocked the business world. Pinnacle Technologies would be implementing a revolutionary profit-sharing program, establishing an on-site childcare center, and creating a fund to help employees pursue higher education. He also announced the promotion of Marcus Williams to Director of Employee Relations, a newly created position focused on ensuring that the company never lost sight of the human element in business. The business journals called it a radical experiment. The employees called it a miracle. On Marcus's first day in his new office 3 floors up from where he used to mope, he found a framed photo on his desk. It showed Hiroshi with his daughter in Tokyo, both of them smiling genuinely for the first time in years. The note attached read, "Thank you for teaching me that speaking the same language isn't about words, it's about understanding the heart. HT." Marcus placed the photo next to one of Emma at her school's science fair, where she'd won first place for her project on sustainable energy. She'd been inspired, she told him, by stories of how small changes could make big differences. That evening, as Marcus walked through the building in his new role, he stopped by the janitorial supply closet where a young father named Carlos was preparing for his night shift. Carlos looked exhausted, worried, carrying the weight that Marcus recognized so well. A inverted question mark state a tilde inverted exclamation mark ¿Es bien? Marcus asked in Spanish, remembering his high school lessons and the words Carlos had muttered under his breath during their brief encounters. Carlos looked up in surprise, his eyes filling with gratitude that some Enia had noticed he existed, had cared enough to ask if he was okay in his own language. Marcus smiled and pulled up a chair, just as he had done with Hiroshi months before, because he'd learned that the most powerful language in the world isn't Japanese or English or Spanish, it's the language of human kindness, spoken fluently by anyone willing to see the person behind the job title. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, but now they illuminated conversations that changed lives, proving that sometimes the most important meetings happen not in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when one person asks another if they're okay and actually stays to hear the answer. And somewhere in Seattle, a little girl named Emma fell asleep knowing that her father had not only kept his promise to give her a better life, but had discovered that lifting others up was the fastest way to rise yourself.